weird sort of view of Asians as others, as strange, as exotic, as otherworldly. But we also, want freedom, right? We want the freedom, as Asian Americans, we want the freedom to be able to do whatever the hell it is that we want to do, right? And have no one, absolutely no one get in our way. And that means do what you want in life, right? Have the opportunities that you want to have, right? These are very powerful, powerful themes. I want you to keep them in mind because we're going to touch on hopefully all of them. Now, I know there's very little that we can do in 2 hours or 1 hour that we have left, and I know that we're not going to be able to cover everything, but I'm going to try. So I'm going to move very, very fast, and I hope that you can keep up with me. I'm going to cover a lot of stuff, very sociological stuff. For those of you who take sociology, history, politics even, or maybe even ethnomusicology, this might speak to you a little bit. For those of you who don't, try to follow along. I'm going to get really to the root, the very, very root causes of a lot of this stuff. So we're going to be talking big picture theoretical stuff, okay? And I know you came here to learn about Asians in the media, and we will talk about Asians in the media, and that is essentially what this is about. But it's a little bit deeper than that. It's not just media, because what media is culture, right? And so I'm going to talk to you about cultural renaissance, the idea of cultural renaissance. And what do I mean by that? So here we go. Well, let's first look at those two words, culture and renaissance. And let's define what we mean when we say culture and renaissance. So I just said, why media? Because media is how we communicate culture, right? Media is the medium in which we communicate whatever our culture is from one person to the next, right? It's the communication of our culture. And why do we focus on culture? Well, because culture is literally everything. Can anyone in here name a few things that are, or what is your definition of culture? Anybody have a definition of culture? Can you define culture, like the Merriam-Webster definition of culture? What is it to you? If I were to ask you to define culture right now, I'm going to put the spotlight on you. Define culture right now. What's culture? If I say culture, what does that mean to you?
I guess like a way of life for a certain group of people.
Way of life, okay. Way of life, that's great. If I were to ask you for an example of culture, any example, give me an example of culture, any culture, yeah.
Art.
Art, okay, art. Give me an example of another example of culture, right? Yeah.
Speech.
Speech, right? So yeah, food. Literally, culture is literally everything. It's everything. It's the food we eat, the words that come out of our mouths. It's the architecture of the buildings we sit in. It's the design of the chairs you're sitting in. It's the way you put your hair up this morning. It is everything, literally everything. So if you want to change the world, you got to change the culture. You got to change the culture first. Culture comes before. Culture is the first thing that changes. We always look at culture as being this monolithic thing that you can't change, right? It's always, to us, it's set in stone, right? You can't change the English language. It is English. What we don't know is that culture actually changes first. It is the first thing to change, and it changes by the minute. We don't even realize it. The English language is a perfect example. Every year, the Merriam-Webster dictionary comes out with a new edition, and they have to put an appendix in the end of the 2,000 new words that have been added to the English language in the past year. Every year they have to do this, because they can't even keep up with the way the English language is changing. We don't speak the same way we did 50 years ago. We don't speak the same way we did 5 years ago. You know what I mean? And that may even come out, because I'm a little bit older than you guys, and some of my slang might come out and you'd be like, well, this guy's old, you know what I mean? It's like it changes. So culture is everything. And if you look at this, I want everybody to think of culture as a house, just so that we're all on the same page. It's very hard to define culture, but for tonight's purposes, I'd like you all to think of culture as a house. Now, when you think of a house, you think of a single unit, right? It's one thing. That is one house, right? It's a monolithic thing in our mind. We consider it to be one thing. But a house is made up of many different things. It's built from many different materials, right? There's doors, there's doorknobs, there's sinks, there's bathtubs, there's rugs, there's wooden beams and foundations and hot water heaters, all this stuff. So it's an amalgamation of all these things. Also, so is culture. So if you take something like American culture, you know, to us, American culture may seem like this big thing, but it's made up of a bunch of different little things. So I just kind of gave you some examples of what American culture is. Obviously, it's much more than this, right? But, you know, some of these things may seem familiar to you, right? Fast food, well, that's American culture. We invented that stuff, right? That's ours. Nobody owns that like we own that. You know, we do fast food better than anybody else. You know, democracy, that's our form of government. That sort of really determines a lot of the way of how we live, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, you could look at the different communities within America, and each community has its own distinct culture too, right? Minorities, white folks, everybody's got their own sort of distinct culture. And whether or not you buy into that, whether or not you live it, you do recognize that it exists, right? So for example, I just threw some up, these are just like funny examples of white American culture, right? So there's the white American house, and it's made up of a bunch of different things, and obviously these are just some of them, and these are more tongue-in-cheek actually, but it's like, you know, like classical music. Obviously classical music, you know, comes from the white cultural canon. Has its roots in Europe, right? Nobody really loves classical music like white people love classical music. I mean, you know, Asians, we love classical music too, but we don't really like, you know, we don't have that connection to it that white people do. And obviously not all white people love classical music, right? Not all white people love bluegrass or rodeo. But it is something that is of that sort of broader culture that nobody else can really lay claim to, right? Asian Americans, even if we love rodeo, we can't really say that rodeo is an Asian American thing, right? You couldn't say that with a straight face, right? Right. I mean, so there's, if you think about each culture as a house, you can even think about the size of the houses, and how big they are. So if you think about white American culture, because of the nature of them, there's just, you know, they're the majority of the population in the United States, and they've been here, you know, for a very long time. They've built up that house, right? They've got a lot of things in that house. Obviously, African Americans sort of helped them build it. In fact, were forced to help them build it, right? But they have built a house for themselves. It is very unique. It is a unique house. You can't say that white American culture is European culture. You can't say that, right? It's two very different things. White American culture, European culture, very different and yet related. You could also look at the Black American house, right? Black American culture. There are certain things, excuse me, that you can point to that African Americans can sort of lay claim to. And they say, that is ours, that came from our community, we own that. And, you know, other people may like it, but it is really ours. You know, jazz, for example, is something that African Americans take very seriously as a point of cultural ownership, right? And other people may be into jazz, and, you know, other people may do jazz very well. But at the root of it, you have to say that it is an African American cultural form, right? So they've got their house, and it is, I just made it a little bit smaller than the white American house, right? Then Latino American culture. And I'm talking about Latino American as in specific and unique to America, not Latino culture in the world. I'm talking about Latino American culture is in the process of being built. I would say that it's coming out with new stuff all the time. Reggaeton, you know, love it or hate it, it is definitely Latino American music. You know what I mean? And it is something that was invented here and that is popularized here. And Latino Americans, whether they love it or hate it, they own it, and no one else can do it the way they do it, right? Asian American culture, as you can see, nothing there, right? Nothing there. But there is a foundation. There's a foundation laid, and I like to argue that there were movements of the 60s and 70s that laid that foundation. And I would argue that it is our generation that must build on top of that foundation, and it is sitting there, waiting and ready for us to build on top of it. So just to get you on, that's just to get you on the same page of thinking about culture the way I think about it. Now let's talk about Renaissance. What is Renaissance? Well, Renaissance is change. The word Renaissance means rebirth, right? Renaissance is creation. It's the creation of something new. So every generation does this. Every generation of every community in the country and in the world, they do this. They take everything that surrounds them, all the culture that surrounds them, they change it up a little bit. They add something new here, they add something new there, and it becomes something completely different, right? And it is, but yet at the same time, it is still the thing it was before. I know that may sound a little confusing, but this is what I mean. Renaissance, which is reinvention, I like to remember it using a handy little word called synthesis. Renaissance, or cultural change, is synthesis. Synthesis is when you have one thing and you have another thing. You blend them together to create something that is completely new, but at the same time still the things that was before. And this is going to come into play as we go along. Not fusion, not fusion. I don't like the word fusion, and I hope that you won't use the word fusion to represent this process. Fusion is kind of a misnomer, because fusion is sort of like when you take one thing, you take another thing, and you kind of duct tape them together, and you claim that you've got a new thing. But it's really not new, it's just two things duct taped together. Like, for example, if you were to take your microwave and duct tape it to your oven with a lot of duct tape, and you try and sell it to somebody saying, look, I made a microwave oven, and it's brand new, and it's costs $5,000. Nobody's gonna buy it, right? Because you're like, obviously you just duct taped a microwave to an oven, and it's not a microwave oven. But if you take the technology of a microwave and the technology of an oven, and you slap them together to create an oven that uses microwave technology, that is something completely new. And you can call that a microwave oven. That is synthesis, right? So when you hear of like fusion restaurants, there's a lot of Asian fusion restaurants. That's quite literally, they're taking French food and they're taking Vietnamese food, and they're just piling them on top of one another and mixing it up and saying, look, this is a Vietnamese fusion food. It's not really something new. It's just sort of taking two things and duct taping them together. I want to talk about synthesis.